Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing card creation with lots of texture using this new Stitched Classic Pooh die set. So this is intended to create some 3D felt objects that you can use for decoration or whatnot, but I'm going to put them on a card. I also have this Classic Pooh felt collection that I'm going to be using, and that's one of the ways that I'm going to be adding some texture. Now these felt sheets are half the size they normally are, so when you order a package, they'll be double the size, but you get a good idea of the colors that are included in the set. So I actually only used the felt for cutting out the Pooh. I did black for the solid back and kind of a honey color for the front piece, as well as the arms and the legs. I chose a floss that was similar in color. This one is DMC number 728. And when I'm doing my stitching, I'm going to be using 3 strands of that floss. So I'm dividing it basically in 2, using the same needles that I use for stitching on cardstock and doing the stitching dies. I do put a knot at the end. Now, because I don't intend for this to be a 3D thing, to be able to see it from both sides, that's why I did the black for the background, but there are pieces in the set to put black behind those openings and have a solid background that you can do with the same color that you do the Pooh for. Now I'm going to do a blanket stitch around the outside of the body as well as the arms and legs. Now to do a blanket stitch, you're going to put the needle from the back to the front, and I like to pull it out just a tiny little bit, and then I take that needle and put the thread underneath the previous stitch, if that makes sense. And that's going to create a line all the way around it, as well as those stitches around the outside edge. Now my felt was getting a little bit off alignment, so I decided to grab my sewing clips and clip those pieces together. You could also use needles if you wanted. The sewing clips are a little bit heavier than needles, so if you find that they're too heavy for you, you can always swap those out with some needles to hold that all in place. So I go all the way around with that blanket stitch, and when I'm doing that, I'm trying to make the stitches even in spacing, as well as the distance from the outside of the felt. So I keep going, putting that needle from the back to the front, pulling just a tiny little bit, and then taking that needle and putting it under the previous stitch. And when I say under the previous stitch, I'm not talking about the one that's already finished in the felt. I'm basically talking about the floss that has come out of that last stitch. It's been a long time since I've done the blanket stitch, so it took me a few minutes to kind of get into a rhythm with it. But once you get into a rhythm, it goes really quickly and easily, except when you're trying to voice over and record, then it seems like it takes a lot longer. But you do want to make sure that those stitches are even, both from each other as well as the distance from the outside of the felt, because it just looks a little bit nicer. It gives a nice finished detail to the edge. It also is one of the ways that it adds texture, by giving that extra detail around the edge. Because I plan on gluing this to the front of a card, it doesn't necessarily need that stitching. It doesn't need it to hold those pieces together. I could glue them together if I want, but because it's felt, because it's something different from cardstock, I thought the blanket stitch just gave it a really interesting and unique finish that you don't normally have on cards. Now you may notice that these dies, as well as the die cuts, don't have any stitching holes around them. So you decide how wide or narrow your stitches are. You decide how close or far they are away from the edge, so you can customize that really, really easily. Now I wasn't sure if my needles for doing the stitching dies were going to work well for this, but it goes through the felt absolutely no problem. I have no problem at all pushing it through the felt. I didn't find that there was any resistance at all to it. The other issue that sometimes I have when I'm stitching felt, especially when it's die cuts that have the holes, is you have to be really gentle when you're pulling that floss through, simply because there's such a narrow area of that felt that if you're a little bit too aggressive with it, sometimes you can pull the thread right out of the hole. Because these didn't have that hole, I found that I could be a little bit more firm with my needle. I didn't have to be quite as gentle, which was nice. And I also, again, love the fact that you can choose which stitching detail you want. Like I'm doing the blanket stitch, but you could always just kind of do I don't even know what those stitches are, where you're just going up from the back and over, and then just up from the back and over. So you're not even catching the previous floss with that with that stitch to create the line around the edge. So you can even do a running stitch all the way around if you wanted. So when you're gluing, or not gluing, when you're stitching these together to create a 3D object, you can also do that same thing. You can pick and choose what stitching detail you want to add to it. Now you'll see when I am finished these pieces, the size they are compared to an A2 card base. I'm doing an A2 card. You could easily do a 5x7 if you wanted to have more space around the outside edges. I typically do A2 cards, so I opted for that, but I have a ton of texture on that little space. So if you wanted to spread it around, making it into a 5x7 card is a really, really simple and easy switch. You would just make a bigger card base, obviously, and the piece that I have for my background that I emboss, you would make that bigger as well as the mat. So I go all the way around the body of this. Now I'm not adding any stuffing to it because the dimension of the felt is going to be enough for the use that I want it for. But if you were creating a 3D object, I would finish, or I would go till probably about 3/4 of an inch space left to meet your previous or where you started. And then I would use some stuffing and stuff it in there using something long to press that or push that stuffing into the areas that you want it to go, just to give it that little bit of dimension. This would be absolutely adorable sitting on a shelf, and I really like the fact that it has its own honey pot with it, a perfect accompaniment for Winnie-the-Pooh in my opinion here. Now because I am gluing this onto a card, I don't need to necessarily worry about the back being as pretty as the front, so I'm going to be knotting my floss on the back of it and then just trimming that excess off. For the arms, I'm going to do one arm and one leg on screen. I'm doing it exactly the same way as I just did that Pooh body. The only difference here is I have just a single layer of felt. If this was something that you were going to do a 3D object for, I would do 2 layers, and then same as the body, when you're say about 3/4 of an inch from your start point, I would just stuff a tiny little bit of stuffing in there. Obviously the arms and the legs are going to need a lot less stuffing than the body. The other thing here is because I'm gluing it onto a card, I'm going to be doing the second arm and the second leg off screen, but I'm not even going to be doing the stitching all the way around. I'm going to be doing it on the on half of it basically. So I'm going to be doing it on the half for the arm that has the hand on it. I'm not going to do the part that attaches to the shoulder because that's going to be completely covered by the body. And then same with the foot. I'm only going to be doing the foot part, a little bit of the leg. There's no point in doing the part that would attach to the body again because it's going to be completely covered. You easily could do it. It would only take a few extra minutes, but because I know how I'm going to be using it, I know it's going to be covered, there's just no point in taking that time. Now, the reason why I'm doing this as a card is because it's intended to be kind of its own 3D object. And I wanted to just give you another way to use the die set, not using it as a 3D object. I'm doing this with felt, but you could easily do this with cardstock if you want. However, with cardstock, I wouldn't be using the needle and thread to do the stitching because it doesn't have those stitching holes to it. I would, if I wanted a stitching like detail, I probably would use a pen, like a gel pen, to create the look of that. That is also the nice thing about using the felt is you can add that little bit of detail. It's going to give you that extra little bit of texture naturally because of that texture as well as the dimension of the felt. Now, when it comes to going to the end of the arm, I do the same thing as the body. I don't need the underside to look pretty. So I finish my stitching and then I just kind of lightly knot it on the back. Because it's going to be glued to a card, I don't necessarily need to worry about that stitch being pulled out because once it's on the card, it's pretty secure. Unless someone actually actively picks at a stitch to pick it out, I highly doubt it is going to come out. So for the arms and the legs, I'm also doing that same blanket stitch. I want to keep that same look going all the way around the edges on all of the pieces that I'm doing. So I typically will start kind of by where the hip would be for that leg. I don't really want to start where the foot is, where there's a lot of nice curves there. When it comes to the curves for these, I do try to keep it somewhat evenly spaced so it looks right with the other stitching. But obviously with those curves, you're going to get a little bit of a different look to it. But trying to keep the the same width apart, or the holes where I'm putting that needle up, the same width apart from each other, as well as the distance from the edge of the felt, is what makes it look evenly spaced. You could even, I think, use a sewing machine if you have one to do this stitching around it, just to say doing a stitching detail around it. The felt itself, I'm not sure how well it would hold up to the feet and whatnot on a sewing machine. It probably would be just fine. But that's another way that you could add some nice stitching detail to it, and you can really customize for the look that you're wanting. So just like with the body and with the arm, for the legs, if you do intend to stuff them, I would obviously be using 2 pieces of felt here. And then when you get about 3/4 of an inch to the start of where you started stitching, then I would use a little bit of stuffing, poke it in there, and just make sure it's nice and even. You don't want to overstuff it and have that felt so stretched that it starts to impact the stitching, but obviously it was going to give it a little bit more dimension by adding that little bit of stuffing in there. It's really not going to take a whole lot of stuffing for the whole thing. So that is how my little bear is going to look here. I've got those 2, or that front arm and the leg, and then we've got the back ones, and you can see how I did that stitching for the back ones. The part that attaches to the body is not stitched at all. It's only the part that is visible. I did the part that it was visible plus just a tiny little bit more, just in case I ended up moving that arm in or out. So I have the rest of the pieces die cut. The bee I die cut with the black and the yellow felt. The wings for that bee are just vellum. For the honey pot, I did that out of cardstock. So I used some Fawn Cardstock for the base. For the honey label, I used some Cascade Cardstock, and then just some black cardstock to go behind that honey piece. Ink blending is going to give this a little bit of visual dimension and also give it some texture because of that ink blending. So I'm going around the pot with some vintage photo distress ink around that honey piece or that label with just some weathered wood distress ink. And then I have 3 wings here that I die cut with that Cascade cardstock. These are just the wings from that bee, but I also thought they would be fun as little blue butterflies. So I die cut them out of blue, but to give them a little bit of visual texture, I'm using some Opal Blush Interference ink with a detailed ink blending brush just to do a little bit of ink blending on them. So the interference inks, I use them a ton in my creating. I have a whole playlist where I have videos where I use them. They have a shimmer to them that they're like magic pads. They have one look on lighter white cardstock and a different look on black or dark cardstock. So for the use that I'm using them here, I just want that little bit of shimmer for those butterflies. And that Opal Blush, it looks blue, and I've got my ink blending in blue, but when you tilt it in the light, you get some pink shimmer to it. For my background, I'm using the Because embossing folder. I have a piece of Alabaster Cardstock here that I had a 1/4 sheet. Once I'm done embossing it, I trimmed it down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. I always trim my cardstock down after embossing it, just so that it doesn't skew the measurements of that cardstock, because some embossing folders will, just depends on the dimension of what you're embossing. Then I'm using some scattered straw distress ink just to highlight some of that embossed area, give that background a little bit more texture. There's texture to it because of that embossing, but that ink blending is also going to highlight that. I'm gluing that onto a piece of Tuscan cardstock. This is going to be perfect for the mat around that embossed piece. And then I'm gluing that onto my A2 card base. So I'm going to set that aside to let that completely dry. And while I'm letting that dry, I'm going to glue my pieces together for my honey pot. So we start with the black piece to go behind that little honey label. Then we glue down the honey label on that black piece. I'm using some Barely Art glue. I use this to glue most of my cards together. It's a nice liquid glue. I have it in a fine line bottle or fine tip bottle because it can work perfectly for gluing little die cuts together, but it also works great for gluing my cards together as well. And by having that liquid glue, I can move and shimmy things in place so I get perfect placement. Gives you that little bit of wiggle room. So with the bee, I use that same glue to glue those layers together. And then I also use that liquid glue to glue the vellum wings on the bee. You could also use white or gray cardstock for those wings, but I do think that vellum just gives it a really nice look to it, makes it look a little bit more realistic. So here's my A2 card base with my embossed background, and we're ready to glue down our little Winnie-the-Pooh here. So I glued down the back arm and the back leg first, making sure that I had that Pooh body on there so that I knew that I was going to get the placement right. You can see that I'm using that same glue and it's going to work perfectly for it. I am a little bit more liberal when it comes to gluing those felt pieces on it. And you can see I have fumble fingers here that I keep dropping them. By using that extra little bit of glue, it's going to compensate for the glue that felt likes to suck up. I'm working fairly quickly so that I can put these pieces down and then put my acrylic block on there to hold everything in place and let that glue set. It's going to take just a little bit longer with that felt than it does with the cardstock, but I want to make sure that it sets nicely. That acrylic block, not only is it going to give it just a little bit of weight to it to hold it in place, but it also is clear so I can see if anything moves or shifts when I put it on and can adjust things as I need it. While waiting for the Winnie-the-Pooh to dry, I'm also going to glue down those butterflies on the sky part here. And this is where I was saying, this is an A2 card base, but if you want more space around all of these different elements, you can easily turn this into a 5x7 card, making your card base as well as the background pieces larger to space those out a little bit more. But we have a ton of texture to this card because of that embossed background, because of those felt pieces and the honey pot. To add just a touch more and take it to the next level, I used a little bit of stickles around the outside of those butterfly wings. They don't have any color to them, but they have that glitter. So it's really going to sparkle and catch the light. And then I used some glossy accents on the honey pot. When you first do those glossy accents, it is cloudy, kind of milky. So you do want to let it completely dry till it's nice and clear. And that's going to give that honey part some nice gloss. So that's going to give it some more texture as well because of the difference in finishes between the cardstock, between the felt, between the stickles and the glossy accents. Those type of things are the things that you do have to wait for them to dry. So sometimes you would omit them just because you don't want that drying time. But in my opinion, they really take things to the next level. For a sentiment on here, I'm using the Silly Old Bear Sentiments. This is a better press plate that came out, I want to say about 6 months ago or so. I have that inked with that weathered wood distress ink, and I'm just doing it on some hammermill cardstock. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. Then I'm using the coordinating die set with some Best Ever Craft tape to tape that die in place and die cut those sentiments. I'm going to be using 2 on this card. The rest of them I will put into a little Ziploc bag, put it right with this press plate and die set. So next time I'm wanting to create a sentiment with this, I may already have one done that's going to work for the project that I'm doing. So for the front of the card, I'm going to use the Silly Old Bear sentiment. And for the inside of the card, there's one sentiment that says time for a little something, or time for a little something. So we're going to glue that on the inside of the card. My glossy accents and stickles are still wet at this point, so I am being very careful when I'm putting them down. But I just thought if I'm going to wait for those things to dry, I might as well also wait for my sentiments to dry on the card as well. So I did give it probably about an hour to completely dry, and you can see that the glossy accents on top of that honey is nice and transparent. The stickles themselves, you don't necessarily see when you see the card up front, but when you tilt it into the light, it really catches the light with the sparkle from it, as well as the shimmer from that interference ink that is used for those butterfly wings. We have a ton of texture in this card just by using different mediums, different finishes with that felt, with the cardstock, with the vellum for the wings. We've got the glossy accents on the honey, as well as little stickles on the butterfly and interference. So there is so much texture to this, but it really takes it to the next level. It makes that card extra special. So if you have the Stitched Classic Pooh or are getting the Stitched Classic Pooh die set, just know that you can also use it for creating cards. This would be great for a decoration on a scrapbook page as well, or even in a frame or as a mixed media project. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.